Okay, welcome to all of you. Before we get started, I just want to bring your attention to the Slido app, because I'm sure a lot of you guys have questions as we get the panel going. So if you want to send in any questions for our panelists here, you can do it through the app, download the app, and send in your questions. So the focus of this panel is about where cryptos are going in the next 12 to 24 months. But I thought we can kind of start by talking about where we've been over the last year, because it seems like 2017 was a pretty big year. Even if you look at where the price went, we were talking about Bitcoin hitting near $20,000 in December. We had the CME launch, Bitcoin futures trading. And then here in the region, a lot of regulatory shakeup over in Japan. We had the law passed that recognize cryptocurrencies as a legal form of payment for the first time. I know you've all heard the analogy before. Where we are right now in the crypto space is very similar to where the internet was in the early years. So that we can kind of kick it off there with a round for all of you. If that analogy holds, then where are we right now? Are we in the early 90s? Are we in the mid 90s? Give us a sense of where you think we are. And Joe, I'll start with you on the other end.
Sure. So there are definitely some strong parallels. We have public blockchain, public internet. We have private permission systems, public permission systems, and around 95, 96, we had lots of corporations that were interested in using the web protocols, the web technology, but they weren't comfortable with this crazy new public internet that was not really private and not secure and not all that scalable at that point in time. And so they started to build systems that were valuable for their internal use, email, web pages, etc. And they built them in an intranet context, basically a context that they felt that they could control. And as the internet became more secure and more scalable and configurably private and confidential, many of these organizations grew comfortable putting some of their systems on the internet. We saw the same sort of activity with respect to cloud over the last handful of years, where organizations, including banks, are now significantly comfortable having their sensitive data on different cloud systems. So blockchain is being used right now in the public context. Bitcoin has gained quite a bit of traction. Ethereum has gained enormous traction with respect to applications being built on it, both in the public context, but there's a lot of activity in corporations and governments and central banks that are building on versions of the Ethereum technology. So we'll continue to see that. And on the public, with respect to the public blockchain, with respect to consumers, there are literally thousands of projects right now that are building out little components, fungible tokens, non-fungible tokens, atomic swap systems, parameterized insurance products, naming systems, etc. All these little components are maturing and are going to be usable increasingly by groups that will put together more and more sophisticated systems. So we're moving into phase 2 of blockchain, where we will see real scalability, where Ethereum can serve as the layer 1 trust system, and built into Ethereum we'll have tens, hundreds of thousands of transactions in the layer 2 systems, and we're going to see that ramified this year.
Yeah, I think we're sort of 1994 as it relates to the technology infrastructure development, and maybe 98 as it relates to the hype around it. So 94 in the sense that, well, one, from an investment perspective, it's still largely a retail phenomenon. Most institutions think waiting for space to mature a bit, waiting for things like custody. Now, there's more coming to the space, but still pretty early. And then while there is a flurry of activity in terms of a ton of talent coming into the space, it's and a ton of interest and idealism, it's still super early in terms of these things being used on a mass level. I think only maybe 4 apps on top of Ethereum have over 1,000 daily active users. Maybe it's more, maybe it's less, but it's still super early on that front. It's sort of our eyes are bigger than our stomachs right now. And I think this is, largely because of things like, as Joe mentioned, scalability, lack of stable coin. And so that's where I think we are.
And we'll get to some of those challenges you talked about in just a bit. Melissa, you want to weigh in on where you think things stand?
Sure. I mean, I think it's, I would say maybe I would go back to even maybe the 1980s in the sense that we're still pretty early in the cycle, and the breadth and depth of the technology and the applications and the implications on the future is pretty significant, but we're still extremely early. And I think what Joe said, it's sort of like layer 1 is out there, and now we're starting to see layer 2 be developed. But from our perspective, we're very early. I think we'll see tremendous amounts of innovation coming out in the sector. And I also think we're going to see probably, computer science departments change direction, and actually, like we saw for the internet and infrastructure layer, we'll see the same level of development that will go on here as well. So from Arbor's perspective, we're still very, very early, and it's an incredibly exciting area that truly can have transformational effect on technology today.
Let's talk about how the blockchain technology is being utilized right now, because I know just being at Rise here in one day, you meet so many companies who say they are utilizing blockchain for X or Y. You're both investors. I imagine you get a lot of pitches on this front. What are the use cases, and how do you sniff out, I think as you described it, sort of the opportunists versus the real innovators on this front? How do you know what a company is doing is necessarily utilizing blockchain in the way it should be, instead of just supplying it the same way you would other technologies?
Yeah, well, I think one of the important things to ask people is why they need a blockchain for what they're building. I think a lot of people are really just trying to capitalize on the hype and the ability to raise money. I heard someone recently say something like, long blockchain marketing, short blockchain. I mean, and so seeing people apply blockchains to verticals where they don't really need, they don't need to be applied. And I think you need to apply it if there's if you're trying to protect against censorship risk or counterparty risk. But other than that, I think the first thing is you better have a really good answer for why you're trying to use a blockchain, because blockchain is, without that, it's very inefficient. You're often better off using a centralized service. So that's sort of the first question.
Well, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think part of the problem, as mentioned earlier, we're in the hype cycle, maybe 1998, 99, wherever we are. But part of the issue is that when companies come in and they say we're using the blockchain, and then you start to dive deeper, well, there's no reason for you to use the blockchain. You could be using a database structure that exists today. So what we're looking for are truly innovators and thinkers and teams that really understand the value of the blockchain and really changing the way maybe database structures are done today by that use, and changing how industries then store and retrieve information and counterparty risk, just, as was mentioned. But, I think part of the issue, like even for this conference, 90% of the blockchain startup emails I got were pretty hysterical. I got one that said, I'm the queen of blockchain. Please look at my company. And we got another one that I'm the master or Dr. Blockchain. And so that to me just detracts from, the technology implications that we're going to have in the future. But we got to get rid of the hype. We got to get rid of the pretenders. And I think there's a lot of great teams out there that are definitely willing to be, that we would be willing to back. But we're definitely in a hype cycle on some of this.
I'm sorry about sending you the queen of blockchain one, by the way.
Okay.
Yes. So
I'm not going to claim to be the queen of blockchain.
If we combine both of your questions, we noticed that the internet started very narrow. Actually, it was about messaging. It was about information display, essentially. And over time, we added e-commerce, mobility, social, etc. Blockchain is starting out very broad. So there are so many use cases. Any time that you want to interact with somebody that you don't know in a trustful context, in a context that's guaranteed to execute, you can use this technology. Anytime you're competing with a group of entities and you want to also collaborate in a shared trustworthy infrastructure, you can build systems for that. We're moving into a world where all the elements of our society are realized currently in analog and frictional components, and we're creating natively digital versions of all those things. So natively digital money and identity and reputation and legally enforceable agreements and certificates, etc. All of those have been built already. So moving into this natively digital world, we'll see the technology ramify in virtually every industry.
Let's talk about the cloud that's kind of been hanging over the space, because I already see we have a question about regulation, and that's the big question here. Obviously in Asia, we've seen kind of two diverging paths. We saw over in China last year, the government regulators shutting down ICOs, exchanges, essentially saying we're going to halt everything until we figure out how this space should be regulated. And then you've got the case of Singapore or Japan who say, well, this is a space that's going to stay and we're going to work with it to see and increase the checks in place. The question really is, who should be regulating the space and how should the regulation look like? I know that's a broad question coming from the States. There's a debate about state and federal. Here in Asia, the context is a bit different. But what are your thoughts on that front in terms of where regulation should go?
Sure. So there are two major categories in which regulation applies. One is with respect to cryptocurrencies. The other is with respect to securities law. I think the cryptocurrencies regulation is going to be more complicated, although I'm confident that there will be important use cases for cryptocurrencies that are acceptable in many nations and that we will continue to be able to use cryptocurrencies. I think we're going to sort things out much more quickly, and it's already being sorted out in many nations around the world with respect to securities. First of all, there are these token launches representing projects that are outstanding projects. They may be immature approaches still, but we're figuring it out, and there will be many of them that do important work. There are also lots of bad projects, and there are lots of fraudulent projects. The problem here is information asymmetry. For thousands of years, people have been taking advantage of naive consumers based on information asymmetries, and that this is exacerbated by the global context of these token launches and the low barrier to entry to do a token launch. So you can basically cut and paste somebody else's project and present it as your own, change the address, essentially. So we need regulators to help us clean up the industry, and that is happening. We can also self-regulate significantly. The low barrier to entry in the global context enables us to set standards so that if you're going to do a token launch, you're going to have to release a white paper, you're going to have to release a certain amount of fundamental information about your project, and we have a project called TrueSet that is going to collect all that information, sort of an Edgar-like database. We have another project called Frontier that will incentivize analysts to surface their results. So ideally, we'll have places on the internet where people can go, consumers can go, where they feel like they're getting reliable information, which is different from the legacy world where a bucket shop could essentially create some shares and sell those shares to grandmothers, and that's much harder to detect. Director Bill Hinman of the SEC a few weeks ago said some very interesting things about consumer utility tokens. He said that if you construct a consumer utility token properly and if you market it properly, then it would not be considered a security. And so that presents, and they really did with these words, define or recognize that there may be a whole new model for delivering services and products to consumers, a networked business model that's held together by these tokens that enables what we call incentivized mechanism design. So you define a set of goals for your system and rules for your system, and selfish behavior of different actors in different roles on the system accomplishes the goals of the system. And so you can have lots of different actors in different roles, and none of them are dominating this particular niche that offers services.
I just want to bring up one point to add on self-regulation. I think that's so important. And I think you're starting to see a little bit. 2017 was the year of the ICO, and 2018 is the year of BIDL, or ship stuff. 2017 was about raising money. 2018 is, okay, now you have $100 million. It's time to ship a product, as Augur finally did yesterday. And I co-founded Token Daily, which is a content site that allows people to track project updates to ensure that people are building. And we also invested in a company called Dirt, which is a protocol for token curated registries. That is their first product is sort of a decentralized coin market cap. So I think self-regulation in terms of us really making sure that we're building and shipping products, and then the education so that people can follow.
You should unpack BIDL for the audience.
Well, HODL is the sort of rallying cry for don't sell, hold your cryptocurrency. And there was that's a meme that you can look up what that means. And BIDL is about build. It's time to ship stuff. We've the money has been raised. It's time to ship product.
Melissa, let me bring you into the conversation, because I think, ICOs is obviously a big concern. And you kind of picked up on the point here in terms of, the question about whether it should be a subject to securities law seems to be almost too black and white, because what you're suggesting is that there's more of a nuanced approach here in terms of some of these industries that are coming out of, how they're trying to raise funds in that way. I mean, how do you think ICOs should be approached? Should there be a new category here in terms of regulation that takes shape, because this is a different way of raising money?
So I'll separate out our views of blockchain from cryptocurrencies and ICOs, but we believe ICOs are just a way to get around corporate governance for early stage companies today. And I mean, people don't necessarily want to hear it, but at the end of the day, if you're selling a security through an ICO, which not every company is, but a lot of them here in this part of the world in Asia have done ICOs because they, for some reason, could not raise venture money. And we're seeing huge amounts of money being raised, and an early stage company raises $100 million, and the investors essentially have no right. At some point, if those companies don't deliver or raising tremendous amounts of capital, we're going to see a huge backlash from the government who said, wait a second, you raise this money, investors don't have rights, retail investors are losing a lot of money, and they're going to put probably regulation in place that if they had regulated the industry now, we wouldn't see maybe such conservative regulation, which eventually we're probably going to see, given a lot of the projects in this region. So I think if you're going to do an ICO, and it's not to avoid having a board member or reporting or corporate governance, and you're doing it really as a utility token, fine. But if you're raising money that's truly a security, I think we got to see some regulation around that earlier rather than later. Otherwise, we're going to have a backlash from the governments. And I think when you look at Asia, actually particularly, Japan has now gotten more conservative than they were a year ago. China has said no. Indonesia has said no. South Korea has become more conservative. And I think Hong Kong will go that direction. Also, when it comes to ICOs that are truly securities and not utility tokens. So that's our view. We would like to see regulation sooner, because I think the fallout will just make it more difficult and tainted later on when maybe it didn't have to.
But I do think we have regulation. I think in the United States we have the Howey test, and we have this new notion that a network can be sufficiently decentralized so that it's maybe not a security or not a security anymore. But
maybe in the U.S., but not here in Asia.
Sure.
We have not seen the differentiation like in the U.S. And the industry in the U.S. in some regards is more developed from what I would say the SEC at least coming out and commenting and being more involved in the education piece. But I think here in Asia, pretty much, I would say 90% of the ICOs were avoiding corporate governance.
Sure.
We only have 2 minutes left here on the clock, but let me just get to some of the challenges as we try to push the conversation forward here. Because I saw a question pop up here where somebody was talking about the Ethereum blockchain now exceeding 1 terabyte here. There is a question about scalability in general as you get more and more people into the network. How big of a challenge is that, and what are the investments you think are still necessary if this is really, in fact, going to get to the masses? Yeah,
so we're just moving from phase 1 in our ecosystem to phase 2. Phase 1 has all these blockchain systems essentially having all the nodes process all the transactions and store all the data. There are pruning systems so that you can run a full Ethereum node in things get pruned over time, and you can run with a fairly reasonable sized database pretty much all the time. There are decentralized versions of Ethereum coming online where the data is stored in decentralized infrastructure. Moving into phase 2, we keep layer 1, that trust layer, that radically decentralized layer, and we add a whole bunch of technologies, state channels, different kinds of side chains mechanisms, some side chains mechanisms linked into Ethereum via Plasma, which is a technology that enables you to move tokens back and forth so that if anything goes wrong in this 100,000 transaction per second game blockchain, you can pull your tokens out to safety into Ethereum. So scalability is going to see tremendous gains this year. We'll see a bunch of games released before the end of this year. There are already interesting advances going on with respect to privacy and confidentiality. We've got some good systems on the private permission side of things and some advanced technology that will enable that on the public blockchain as well.
Okay, let's see if we can get one more question in just in the countdown there. One more challenge we've been talking about is security. And here in Asia, obviously, we saw a big hack with a coin check over in Japan. That's just one. How secure do you think these exchanges are? And is that still a big hurdle, you think, in terms of gaining trust?
Sure. So there have been many exploits in our ecosystem. They have pretty much all been at the periphery of the system. So while hundreds of millions of dollars have been stolen, the protocols have actually been rock solid with respect to security. They've been operating properly. But where you have the gateways between the legacy financial world and the decentralized world, you have traditional database systems, and you have poor practices, and you have vulnerabilities based on essentially people trying to store private keys in old-style databases, and smart hackers have been taking advantage of that. So that absolutely needs or could benefit from some regulation, some real rigor in building those systems, building decentralized exchange systems. The other vulnerability is at the application layer. For instance, on a platform like Ethereum, it is complex to write software that directly accesses value tokens. And so we need to harden those layers over time.
I think one thing also, in addition, holding the space back is sort of lack of a stable coin or excess volatility in pricing, because we have what's known as the pizza problem, which is you pay for a pizza Bitcoin, and then it's Bitcoin appreciates 5,000x, or Ethereum appreciates. You're not going to want to use these things for payments. So either Ethereum or Bitcoin have to become much less volatile, or we have to see the rise of Maker or Basis or any of these attempts at stable coins take shape. There's a big opportunity there.
Yeah, I think the solution is the stable coins. Maker DAI is doing very well, hundreds of millions of dollars in that, and there are so many price stable token projects coming online.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much to all of you, and thank you.
Thank you.